Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Well, good. Welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking to two people at the same time. I don't know if it's on your left or on your right, but Omar, he's the male fellow. Omar Imady, I hope I've said that right.
Yes.
Yes, Omar Imady, an author and currently living outside of London, England, and Noel Hagman, an editor, among many other things, and an editor of Omar's books or books to be. And we can do a little bio in a second, but and welcome. And Noel's living in Turkey. So, and the truth in advertising, I just met Omar, and I have known Noel for quite a few years. She attended a school I worked at years ago, and despite that, she's agreed to participate.
Since I was 14, I've known you. That's what it means,
Yes,
actually.
I know, just wild, And you're what, 20 now?
Very close to 14, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, it's unusual that I have not seen conversations between authors or among authors and their editors. Those are conversations you all have with one another. And I'm not sure how common it is to get a little bit of, peel back the curtain and see or hear what goes on. But I do want to say, I have read with, here it is. I have read with delight, actually, Omar's little bio that I'm hoping you wrote it, but whoever wrote it is just phenomenally whimsical and fabulous. So, so I'm gonna read it because I want to make sure I do justice. Omar Imady is an uncommon collection of many things: poet, historian, novelist, Syrian, American, exile, Sufi, Wattsian, I share that, cat lover also, avid coffee drinker as well, and insatiable gastronome, all of which find expression in his growing repertoire of eclectic fiction. He's the author of multiple books, and if you don't believe me, you can check it out on Amazon. He is the author of multiple books, including the Gospel of Damascus, a 2012 Book of the Year Award finalist, and When Her Hand Moves, a collection of 3 controversial, thought-provoking novellas. His forthcoming novels, and I want to emphasize the S, novels, dig ever deeper into the human experience of alienation and the quest for a meaning in a world increasingly hostile to answers. And Noel, I'll read yours in a second, but I want to ask. So welcome again. And do you think the world is increasingly hostile to answers?
I do, and it works in kind of a dual way. So on one hand, those who adamantly claim to have the answers are equally hostile to answers.
Yes.
Right. And then there are those who are in essence indifferent to answers, or who don't believe there are answers.
Don't even know there are questions.
Right. Yes. And I think that to navigate yourself in between both is really quite a challenge, and you never quite arrive, but the journey in itself is quite an experience.
Good answer.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I mean, do you think most people live without the without the belief? Belief may be too strong a word. Without a sense that there really are questions. You know, life is just life. You do what you do, and the the questions, if there are questions, is how do I take the next step forward in the best way for myself or my family or my community or whatever? And do you really think that?
That in
Yeah.
itself is an excellent question. Obviously, there is no. I mean, my answer would be reflective of my own experience, and it's
Mhm.
not necessarily one that everyone would relate to. But I tend to think that to ask is our default state. I think in we begin in this natural state of asking, like children ask beautiful questions, often fascinating questions, and there's this sense of wonder. It's beautiful, and you know, and an eagerness to understand things
Mhm.
that may not necessarily be easy or sometimes even impossible to understand. And I think as we proceed on this journey, we tend to be locked in again these two distinct polarized categories. One, and obviously family and culture and society have a lot to do with this, where you're locked into answers that are very specific and very dogmatic and intolerant often of further question and as you grow older, or you seem to develop a sense of indifference, bordering at times to hostility to the very questions.
Mhm.
Because after all, your attempt, you see those who claim to have answers, and they're clearly a turnoff. So you don't want that, and no one else is seemingly equally interested.
Mhm.
And I've always felt that it's I can't quite see myself in either place. I don't think the point is the answer. I think that the point is the question. I think if you can keep asking, you're where I want to be.
Mhm.
To keep asking. The moment you think you know the answer is the moment where you risk either being locked or being set up for a massive disappointment. Something to that effect, I think.
Do
Yep.
do you are there questions that burn for you that are sort of enduring that you can, the through line is there for a long time, not necessarily forever, but are there questions that you live with as a living, it's almost a life force, right? I mean, they're there. You wake up in the morning and you go to sleep at night, and when the world gets quiet, there they are.
Well, I think it's there's so much that is inbuilt to the experience, and this is where I find it difficult to understand those who numbed their desire to ask. So for example, though I don't talk about Syria formally anymore, but Syria, the type of pain and suffering that took place, the people who were arrested, the people who were tortured, some of these very young, innocent men and women who found themselves suddenly in a dungeon somewhere and were either traumatized for life or never had the chance to leave. So how do you process this? What do you So obviously the problem of evil or theodicy, is an extremely, it's an ancient question, but I have to find a way to understand why I'm here talking to you
Mm.
and enjoying this beautiful experience, and why any one of those young men and women who stood up and protested for dignity and for freedom may now be in a very different place. So these are the kind of things that force the question, or else you could easily hear about a child, and it doesn't have to be a child, who is experiencing some difficult sickness that we are yet to find a cure for, and
Mhm.
the question comes back. So there are those types of questions that force themselves, but those are not obviously, those are just the beginning. I think the idea of it, I want to say purpose, but it's far more than purpose, really. It's the sense that, ironically, a lot of these conversations I've had with Noel, because Noel is not, I don't
there.
here as an editor. I mean, though of course she is, but we've had a lot of conversations of this type, and trying to identify, what makes two people find a common sense of purpose. How does this happen? A sense of recognition, things of this type. Those are the more light questions, but they're equally captivating and yes. I could share with you questions all night.
that may be actually wonderful. So, but speaking of Noel, so I know her as a 14-year-old student, but a lot has happened since then. Noel is, in addition to
Please do
living
not
in,
read the whole bio.
I'm not
Just
going to read the
first
whole bio.
paragraph.
But, Noel is a partner and editor-in-chief and chief creative officer for, you say it, is it Villa Magna Publishing?
Villa Magna Publishing, yeah.
Villa Magna Publishing, which is headquartered where? Or
In
several
Virginia Beach,
places?
but doesn't matter. Yeah.
And when did this, well, she is, in addition to that, she was herself an artist, or is still an artist. I didn't know about that aspect of your life until that one opening of those extraordinary, I mean, to call them shoes. I know it's gonna,
That's
if
right.
anybody's,
You mean that event? Yeah.
I mean, Noel created these one-off shoes like that were just the most remarkable things in the world. I mean, I was a dutiful head of school,
You were so cute.
and say, hey, we're gonna have this show, and would you come? So of course, because I'd love to see Noel. And I walked in, and it was like, oh my God. So how do we get from that? How do we get from that to you're living in Turkey, and you're editing, you're part owner, and you're editor-in-chief and a creative officer at a publishing company, and then we'll get
And
to
most
the,
importantly,
why this.
Omar's editor.
Yes. Well,
Creative content.
quite specifically, Omar's editor, as I understand it, right? Omar doesn't want another editor. You can't.
No, of course. Yes. But again, that word doesn't quite capture what she does.
Great. That's great.
And
So
also, he doesn't need a lot of editing, just so you know. So it's like an easy thing for me. So how do I
you're
get from-
overpaid is what you're saying. You're overpaid.
Right. Yes. Very much. Right. I mean, I was kind of, I don't know, right? I went to school for something totally different. And then I was like, forget that. I'm an artist. Hello. And so I got into that weird thing, which had like I'm sorry about this cat, by the way.
No,
It's
no,
a
you're
brand new
talking.
cat that we learned.
You're
Yeah.
on screen with two cat lovers. So it's
I know. And so, right. So I was doing this weird thing, it kind of seemed like, oh, maybe I can, there's just some doors open in that avenue for me. But then I met this captivating Turkish man, and he lured me to move to Istanbul. And I said yes in 6 months, and here I am. And so I was kind of like thinking about keeping up that part of my thing here, but like with the shoes, for instance, there was always like a ceiling on that for me, right? It was just maybe like something that could open some doors into other things creative,
like eyeglasses or hair bands or
well, I just want to like paint everything. That's also my husband's biggest fear. We get something new and he's like, please, I do not want to come home and see this covered in acrylic paint. Like, just please.
I know those conversations.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, exactly. So, I just kind of stopped that part, and I raised some young kids in the meantime, and established my life here. And I'm always doing creative things and working on projects. But this opportunity to be a part of this publishing company was just like one of the best things that's happened to me, because I get to be creative and do, graphic design and things like this. And then I get to work with creative people. And I get to read a lot, and I love reading so much. So, and I get to push myself and, exploring new parts of business that I just haven't, because I've never worked in the corporate world before or anything like that. So,
And we were just chatting. We said it jokingly, but my understanding is the relationship that you have as editor author, you that you are insistent. You don't want to work. You don't want to work with another editor. You want to work with Noel. So talk about that. What is so special about that?
talk about that.
Okay, so I think it's really the conversation. There's a conversation that takes place with Noel that I don't understand it as an act of editing, though of course it does have that layer.
I agree.
It's more of she has this distinct way of she knows what I'm trying to say, which is really not easy. Because
To be in
often,
his brain.
right, often I'm not quite sure of what exactly I'm doing. And then she has this talent of identifying what you might call these things here and there that are not quite in sync with this thing. Again, that is difficult to define, and she can just pick them up. It's really fascinating. She just goes through and she can tick tick tick, and you learn to trust it, and you learn to see that because you first you're resistant. You don't want to make these changes, but then you realize that once you've moved this to the right and you've gotten rid of this and you've changed, taken this to above, and once you've done this, what you're trying to say is actually clearer and more accessible. And it's also because, you see, part of it is the thing that I was trying to share in my own mind had various layers. Some of them were possibly fear. Am I really going to say this, for example? And this is where Noel would act as, the push. Say it, just say it, right? So there's that. There's some times where I would be saying it, but I would be moderating it in some other places or giving it a frame. And she has this talent where she can identify where I've done that and remove those or go after them. Again, and she has the patience for the argument that will follow, because it's not that I'm easily giving in on this, but precisely because I'm not quite sure of it's only after, in retrospect, that I realize where this was, where it has arrived. And so it's really uncommon to because how does this even work? I mean, my background and Noel's background are Asian.
Actually, I really would like you to talk some about that, because I think that's one of those really interesting things that you are. I think you said you are. Your mom was American. Your dad was Syrian.
My father's from Damascus, yes.
You grew up in the Middle East. You grew up in
Syria and Kuwait, yes,
Syria
yes.
and Kuwait. And although you're obviously comfortable with English, and you studied in the United States for your graduate degree, and you studied in England or Scotland, I don't remember. I think that's right. Where did you study as an undergraduate?
No, undergraduate in Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Oh, in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Right.
Oh.
Well, right. And then University of Pennsylvania for my graduate studies.
Got it. Okay, so you are familiar with American culture, but there is that, you know, your roots are in the Middle East when you were young, and now you're working with you know,
Me.
a kid from Malibu.
Right. Well, even if we were both, from Malibu, it would still be very unlikely to have this
Yeah.
line of communication, this thin,
Mhm.
because how often do you meet someone who's trying to share a message that is ultimately in some way or another linked to the fact that he grew up as a Muslim in Damascus, and then but with a very unfamiliar spiritual take on it. So what are the odds that you would find someone who clicks with that, gets it,
Mhm.
identifies with it, and at the same time wants to help you share it? It's really quite it's not something. So for all these reasons, this again, this conversation that takes place between Noel and I, and that takes place on every one of our books, it's really very important to me. And while it has,
It's a
again,
special
an
thing.
editor
Yeah.
dimension, it's much more than that. Yes.
Okay, so I want to
Yeah.
I want to be slightly unfair. So Noel, what can you say? What this thing, recognizing that it's almost impossible to put into words without a book or two or 10. But what is this thing that Omar is heading towards?
Well, you mean where he's going with his works as he progresses with the bodies of work?
Yes, well, he pointed at the unlikely possibility of finding anyone, let alone a kid from Malibu, but finding anyone who would understand his take
Right.
on. So what is that?
Yeah, let me comment on this.
Right.
So, you meet these people and it's like there was something we just started this company and, kind of taken over. My mom and I came and we met with Omar and it was kind of like, well, who's going to be working with him as a creative editor? And we kind of just decided that it would be me. And then within like the first one or two email exchanges back and forth with Omar, I'm telling you, and at least for me, it was just so clear that this was like a perfect fit. Great friendship, that we just spoke to each other in the same way. We had the, same way of expressing what we needed or wanted from each other and how to go about things. And, he's an artist and he's taking ideas and words from his brain and putting them out on paper. And that's a hugely like intense process. And it's a very vulnerable process. And uh, he's an artist and I get artists, been around them my whole life. So we just immediately, I feel like we just clicked and I could, I understood what I needed to understand about how his brain works. And I think there's something weird about the fact that I did go to school for international affairs with the, study in the Middle East. And so it's like, I was just quite familiar actually with certain things that maybe another editor might not be, so I could understand some of the influences in his content maybe a little bit more differently than like an average American editor. So I think that helped too. But
So Omar, I want you to tell me, because I'm still hungering for what's the
I'll give
what's
you an
what's
example.
I didn't answer your question good.
no, I'm searching for, because Omar made reference to the unlikely the unlikeliness of meeting anyone who would understand your take on a particular thing that having to do with, and what is that thing? I want to
Well,
know.
here's one example. So this applies on Islam, but it also really applies on Christianity and Judaism. There is in all of these religions a concept of what we call God, and this concept may have legal dimensions in terms of what you do and what you don't do.
Mhm.
And then if you move on to a more spiritual approach, it takes on a more personal relationship. But in either place, God, and that word in particular, is at the center of these experiences. So when I first started writing some of these novellas, for example,
Mhm.
I had come to the conclusion that this particular word has become, to many of those I was trying to reach out to, very difficult to relate to. The problem begins with the very fact that the word in the final analysis has a specific gender. We're using God as opposed to goddess, for example. That the word has a specific gender, and then it has a lot of imagery associated with it. At its perhaps traditional common form, it comes with a king on a throne, and beneficent, ruthless, forgiven, randomly at times, arbitrarily, but there's always a wisdom that you may or may not understand, etc. And while I grew up with this, and for a long time I was at peace with it, I became problematized both as within my own experience, but also in terms of my recurrent conclusion that as long as you hold on to this word and its associated imagery, you're placing people under a false option. So one can either relate to this and hence call herself or himself a believer, or one cannot, and then they spin out quickly into who knows where. Often it can take on, especially, this may sound surprising, but a lot of there's a growing phenomena of young Muslim men and women who are almost hostile in a militant way to their religious experience. This is increasingly unfolding, and in countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, where you wouldn't really expect it to be taking place. And if one agrees that part of at least the problem is this false option, you either accept this word with everything that comes with it, and it's more than a word, obviously, right? It's an idea, it's a concept, or you exit entire experience and walk out. And so against this background, I was experimenting with finding a way around this. I want to share an intense spiritual experience, but one that may have sensual, even erotic dimensions. And at the same time, I don't want to use words or terms or ideas that alienate the audience that I'm most interested in, really. The audience that I feel is constantly placed in this polarized false option paradigm. So
What's that audience?
what was that?
What audience is that? Who is this? I mean, you're writing for everyone, but who are you writing?
I'm writing for everyone, right? But for example, I would think of, I think my daughters in particular had a lot of impact on this. Just watching my daughters grow up in a Muslim country, and with the choices that they were having to face in terms of either accepting this entire full package with God as its center, or just walking out of the entire experience. And I felt that in the way in which this is being presented, something very significant is being lost, so to speak. And what I began to do, going back to how Noel clicked in with all of this, is I just realized that there's something really fascinating taking place to a certain extent in the Hebrew Bible, but in a more pronounced way in the Quran, which is that there is this almost unexpected speaker that is always speaking in the plural we. Now, traditional explanations will have you understand that this is nothing other than, God the king speaking in the royal pronoun.
Mhm.
But if you really look carefully, you realize that something very subtle and different is taking place. There is something distinct. The we is almost like the signified. So God becomes yet one of many signifiers to a phenomena, to something much deeper, much more. I think Paul Tillich describes it as a grounded being, something deeper, something else. And I use the we as a way to capture this, the we. So going back quickly to what would take place with Noel clicked with this idea of the we as though she grew up with it, and started using it with me as though it was very, very familiar. And then she would notice that every now and then I would, possibly out of inertia and background, come back to the word God. And she would pick that up. We would have even discussions on the title, I was thinking of something like God wears a dark, a blue headscarf or something like that. We had things of this type, but she.
And I tell him, no God.
Right.
Not in the title.
No God here, no God there. And she was saying this even as, because you could imagine someone who was not necessarily open to a book that had a religious nature, but she wasn't doing that at all, because she would say, she would go back to the we and speak about the we as though it's so familiar to her, even though it was something quite new in my head. And I was, coming, almost polishing it and sculpting it at the very same time that I was actually producing these first novellas, trying to capture a way to signify what we call God in a manner that is relatable, in a manner that does not carry with it so much of the imagery that alienates, me included, really, but many others as well. And
unifying all religions and exposing this just cosmic element too, right? Yeah.
not very much what Noel said, but without that, where this is not quite a new age thing. So
No, I get that. Yes,
not there. This is coming out of from within what you might call the traditional religious experience, but it's trying to recast it in a manner that changes the entire vocabulary. And in these novellas, David, there's always these angry Muslims who are young Muslim men and women who are angry, alienated by all of this. So this is the fact that these characters are there is purposeful, because they're vocalizing in many ways the frustration of an entire generation, not only of Muslims, I think, but it's across the board. And we see this everywhere, really. I mean, wherever you look, traditional religion has increasingly lost its capacity. Well, there's always exception, of course, but to actually become something that is relatable. And a lot of this has to do with language. It has to do with imagery. It has to do with experience. It has to do with what is censored, which is another important point, because I find it extremely important within these intense spiritual novels to infuse them with the unexpected, things like the sensual and the erotic, precisely to emphasize that we're not describing a puritanical experience here, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, two questions as you were speaking come to mind. One, and either answer none of them or both of them, or you pick and choose. But you just made reference to angry men. I mean, it occurs to me I mean, it's hard to give words, which is why you write books. It's hard to give words to what you're talking about, and so I apologize if it comes out clumsy. But do you think if you crack the code of doing what you're talking about, is that important in today's world? Is that something that you see as not necessarily the only thing that will save us, but as a clue about how to undo some of the challenges of today's world? And the other piece that occurs to me is what you're describing. I am among other things, I am not an expert on Muslim religion or
Right.
any other religion, but it occurs to me that some people could be really pissed off about this effort.
Right.
So how does one dance on that edge? Or I'm not asking for a how do you do it, but if you would talk about that dance, both from your experience and, you and I spoke briefly before, your mom is still in Syria,
Yes.
and Noel is, although Turkey is a different place, Noel is in a Muslim country. Well, theoretically it's secular, but we know it's moved moves further in that direction.
Had a bit of regression actually lately.
So,
Yeah.
and so I just asked a lot of stuff
That's
wrapped
a
in
great
round.
question though. It's a
So,
great question, David. It's a
so
very,
if you
very
want-
good question.
if you both, either one of you will talk about either of those, that would be great, because that's such tricky, and it feels to me, I mean, I got excited as you were describing it, because it's like, gosh, if you could do that, if you could do what you're saying, there's like, it's like there's
It's
a
this
chest.
utopian thing or something, right? I know. And
As
he's
light
like
is
figured it out.
emanating from this chest. If you could just figure out how to
Mhm.
open that. So,
Oh, that reminds me of this one piece of imagery in the Gospel of Damascus, right? With the golden sun, this chest. Yeah. But exactly. It's like on one hand, there's this, it's just this beautiful message that talks about all religions, but it's this united way about explaining them and talking about them, which is just so, it's such a beautiful thing that just comes across as how all religions are more similar than dissimilar. And this message that he has. And then on the other hand, there's very controversial material, more so for certain religions, right? I mean, Islamic religion is a little less accepting of uh opinions
deviation.
on certain things. Yes.
Well, I'm
And
not sure that I'm
like
not sure.
Omar
I think there are
said,
fundamentalists everywhere, right? I mean,
that's
the
true. That's true.
crazy people.
That's true. That's true. But then also just some of the content is a little risque and a
You mean
little different. And it's
the content of the books?
of the books. Yeah. Right. It has some elements to it that are a little risque, but there is kind of a fine balance because he's doing both so beautifully. And this is one of the reasons I love him so much, is I can't imagine another author actually tackling this so well.
Hmm.
So now, Omar, you go ahead and tell how you do this.
Like, or at least talk about that experience, like that sort of walking on the edge of a knife.
Yeah.
Right. I think it goes back. There's this story that took place when I was a student at the University of Pennsylvania. There was something called, it probably still is, the Muslim Student Association. And the Muslim Student Association was this, they would have a party every year to welcome new students. And they had this way where they would, in essence, only invite what they understood to be the very religious, the women who wore scarves, and the young men who were known to attend, Friday prayer and things of this type. They had a way to exclude what they regarded as the Muslims who are not committed to their religion as they understood commitment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was maybe at my second or third year there, I happened to know someone who was on the committee that would organize this, and we had this talk, and he was quite open to me, and I convinced him that we should do this entirely different this year. We should invite everyone. No, we should even go beyond that. There was the Hilal, which is the organization for Jewish students on campus. There was a Christian association. We should just invite everyone. This is the way it should take place. And I said, they're going to meet in classes. So what sense does this make? And I said, the last thing you want is to have like a health club. Only the healthy are allowed in. It should be a place where healthy in their perception, of course, but nevertheless, it should be a place where everyone is invited. It's a place where those people they're excluded may be the people who are in most need to meet others who may have a sense of warmth or something peaceful about them. Anyway, he was convinced, and he I'm sure possibly regretted this, but he made the decision, and everyone was invited, and it was a beautiful experience. But he was fired from the committee. And it was never,
Nice move.
and it never took place again. But
For greater good.
right. So going back, I think to what I'm trying to do, I see myself inside a mosque or a church or a temple, and it has lots of locked doors, and maybe very few doors with a lot of restrictions and rituals of entry. And I want to get rid of the doors, but I'm not throwing stones at the mosques or the churches. I respect them. So this is not an experience of disrespect or I'm not hostile to them. On the contrary, I want to open them up. I want people to come in. I want them to feel welcome. I want them to feel like they're in familiar surroundings. So if there are certain types of imagery or ideas or things that make them feel at home, I would like to to furnish these places in a manner that they can relate to, because I feel like this process. Otherwise, we've transformed these into either health clubs or prisons, really, and either way, it's not sustainable. They're becoming part of the past, and then we go back to the false option where you're either within these locked answers, or you spin out into all kinds of places that may not be, maybe nice and healthy in various ways, but at times are extremely alienated and lonely. So yeah.
Have you met people who've read your work and were displeased, not because not because they were bored with the story, but because you somehow crossed a line that they would prefer you did not cross?
Yes. Yeah. Some of them are friends, and some of them family members.
Oh, well.
Yeah, because you see, you're placing things again. Go back to that metaphor of within a mosque or a church that people are just not used to seeing in it. It's not. They can read books that may have sensuality or questioning, though, but then they read books that have religious content. They just don't.
They don't come
Not
together.
meant
Together.
playing with their heads in their minds, and you're mixing what is not supposed to be mixed,
Mhm.
and it's being done purposely. Because, and I'm not doing I think this is important. It's not that I don't see myself as having a mission. I'm doing this because that's how it is in my own head.
Mhm.
They are together, conflated, and this is how I experience it. Otherwise, I wouldn't really be able to
Yeah.
authentically
Mhm.
articulate it.
And which that's the beauty of this is like the fundamentals of the way you think is just so beautiful, right? I mean, and I think that's what you got as well, David. It's like in his brain, these things work. You can be this and you can be that, but then also this is okay. And you can still be that, but open your brain up a little bit. And it's such like a just the underlying kind of
I'm
um
chuckling. I'm chuckling because so I was born Jewish. Um, I I uh, I have a very good friend who is originally from Israel, and he reminds me every once in a while that I'm not really Jewish. I'm Jewish.
right.
It's like so
Right.
so, but he stays in the room and he remains my friend. And and there are others who I've met who don't want to stay in the room. In fact, wouldn't walk in the room to begin with because I'm one of those.
Right.
So,
The
so
Jew is
it is. Yes,
right.
it strikes me that, well, I mean, you know, in the last few days, I wonder if that's affected you, Rod. I mean, Salman Rushdie's most recent event in New York, where he was attacked and happily is going to survive.
Yes.
But do you wrestle with that at all, or do you go through your world? It's too much. There's too many things on the plate. You don't want to have that one.
Right. I
Well,
think yeah, sorry, Noel, go ahead.
I mean, because we can edit this out, by the way, but you know, one of the things was, and with this first book, like my husband and you know, a couple friends
Can
who
you
knew of the
mention the title? The first book you're referring
When
to
Her
is
Hand Moves.
When Her Hand Moves.
When Her Hand Moves, which is 3 novellas in
Yes.
one. You know, there were certain parts of it that were a little, well, there are certain parts that are controversial in many ways. For me, I'm comfortable with this and I'm okay with this. But then it was interesting for me to look at it through another person's eye, a couple other people who like live in Turkey and understand things, are open-minded liberal people, right? Who kind of said, like, be careful, right? We don't need, and I think I think this is a little, you know, the be careful was a little aggressive, but there was a sense of like, you know, maybe we should leave these words out and not push this a little bit here. It just might invite unnecessary reactions. And Omar and I discussed this all in length. And what did we end up? We ended up making just a minor change here or there. We didn't change too much, but because also we want to be able to talk about these things.
Mhm.
But for me, it was interesting because it's just in my mind having to talk about, is there like a threat to doing this, was not something I ever would have expected. But I live in Turkey. And
Yeah,
so it's something that is at least worthy of a conversation about.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I live in Wyoming and and uh and have discovered just how there's a lot of open-minded people here. There are a lot of people who are not in any way open-minded about
Right.
certain things, and and
It
just
can be scary.
just your existence is is is
Right.
perceived by as a threat. Right?
Yeah.
Forget they don't even necessarily know what your ideas are, but just your existence is a
Yes.
threat.
No,
And Omar, I think you should talk now too. But when this happened, I texted with Omar right away, and his reaction I thought was just so like, just accurate. It's just the saddest thing is that this is all done in the name of faith.
Mhm.
There's violence done in the name of faith, which we know is just
Sure.
this, one of the most like, historically, one of the
Yeah.
sorriest things of our human existence. But yeah, Omar, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's in the way in which this is laid out as a map, so to speak, you have so there's two approaches. You have those and they can be writers and novelists, even comedians who have the approach of that the only way you can get rid of the hold of these types of people is by ridiculing the sacred, but going after it, by
Mhm.
in a deliberate, like some very famous American comedians, they can do this sometimes, and it's quite powerful, right? When someone stands up and goes after some strongly held idea, and they do so, through satire and jokes, and some of them can be quite toxic, and people, at times are upset, even people who are not religious at all. I mean, it could be about any one of the strongly held ideas in our society. And then obviously the comedian or the novelist comes back and says, this is art. I mean, this is not something that you can, it has its own logic, and you can't censor my desire to articulate myself this way. There's that approach, and there's many representatives of that. What's interesting is that I don't quite see myself as controversial as a lot of the ideas are. Once again, they're not because I don't experience them as such, not because I'm attempting to do this. They're not someone throwing a stone. They're someone opening a door, which is quite different. And I'm not in any way disparaging those who would throw stones, because they have their own logic in their mind. Unless you throw stones, the door is going to stay locked. And the very existence of these structures is problematic. But I don't find myself or my work to fall under that category. It's not disrespectful. It's simply unthinkable, which is quite a different thing. It's not that I am. So I'm speaking from within and share a very different take, as opposed to standing outside and saying, "You idiots, what are you doing?" Which is legitimate, but it's not my approach. Right. So they are, but nevertheless, to those on the inside, it doesn't really matter whether you're trying to open the door or you're throwing stones. You can be easily classified and dismissed as hostile either way. But it's a subtle difference, and I think it's an important difference.
No, I think it's a huge, really, I think that's a hugely important. And, it's almost like you can't do much. One cannot do much unless one is truly an artist, which you obviously are, but one cannot do much to affect those who will not listen, who will not read, right? I mean, I forgot what percentage of people did not read Salman Rushdie's book, and yet decided he deserved to die. But that may be part of the answer to the question of what's the audience. The audience is the people who are behind those closed doors, or want those doors closed, and yet are not intolerant of the idea, who will say, "Oh, geez, maybe that's worth thinking about."
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
His writing, there's nothing dogmatic in what he's writing, and it's all inclusive. That's it, right? So it really is. So there's certain groups that maybe just need to hear, be what you are, and you can do this, but also it's okay to have open eyes about things.
Mm.
And Omar does this in such a beautiful way, in addition to just being like a fantastic writer. I mean, the way he writes fiction, it's unbelievable. And I think you earlier mentioned, like, women, and he knows women. He writes from the point of view of women, and he thinks women are just the most powerful things ever. And he writes it so beautifully. And that's also something that's a little shocking for a male writer to be able to do so well,
Yeah. Just to be really clear, I would say 99.999% of the world's population, male population, know that women are are right, but
Right.
they may not be able to stand in their minds like Omar. But we all know.
It's good.
Well, I had this beautiful,
Easier for us all.
uh, I had this privilege of growing up around lots of very powerful women.
Yeah.
We lived in this building in Damascus, and on the first floor, my two aunts were unmarried, lived, and then it was of course, my mother. I had two sisters, no brothers, and my father was always at work. And then we had an apartment rented, more women. So the building was just full of women, and they would constantly, open, each other's doors and go in, unannounced, and to grow up around that. And each one of them, with her own distinct, powerful voice, is something that really is quite remarkable. One of the most important doors that I constantly try to get rid of is this door that attempts to manage, organize, restrict the entry of women into this space, and in the process, many women, especially today, just say, forget it. I'm not standing in the line. I'm not going to be, told that I need to do this and this and that, and to be able to enter. And I don't need to sit in the back, and I don't need to be told where I can pray and where I can, all of this stuff. So metaphorically, I try to capture this and emphasize this over, just because I used to hear, not once again, because there's a message that I want to convey. It really doesn't, I don't experience it that way. All the voices of the women I grew up around come back to me. And I want to share these voices through the characters that I include.
So would you speak? I want to be respectful of your time, but would you speak some about what's next? I mean, and if somebody wants to read your stuff, where should they start? Should they start with the book that you almost, was it, you're a finalist in for the book award? Should they
The
start?
Gospel of Damascus.
Yeah, right. So that would, say it again. So
The Gospel of Damascus.
The Gospel of Damascus, or should they start with When Her Hand Moved?
What do you think, Noel? I trust Noel's take on this.
Thank you for saying that. I really feel, and we kind of talk about this often, and because he has written many more books that are slated to be published. He's on fire. But I really feel like they should be read as they were put out, because he writes from this authentic space that it just makes sense. And if you start with his first one, you kind of go along with him in his journey as a person and a writer and the content that's in there. And so for me, it makes sense to just start with that first one and go on this journey with him. And it makes sense. It will make sense for somebody who knows nothing about Omar or his, personal history or anything like that. It actually just comes through in the writing. and it would make sense to start with that. Also, you can pick up any one of them and read them and then go back, and that
And
would work.
they stand on their own.
They do. They all stand alone. I just see something that
Mhm.
I think it's more powerful if you follow his works with his journey as a person and a writer.
And what's next? You say there's more coming. So is it, Omar? Is it? Have you got a tiger by the tail, and it's this tiger that's pulling you around, or are they? Or did you catch another cat on the way?
Right. You know, I think sometimes I sit and say to myself, you know, when I finished my university studies, I went back to Damascus and I worked for the UN, and then I worked at University in Jordan, and then I worked for the Center for Syrian Studies at the University of St. Andrews. And I sometimes sit down and say, like, you know, I wasted so much time and all these stories that I've always wanted to write. And I never really had the type of conducive space, you know, where I could just sit down and because any one of these jobs always comes with the type of tension and contacts and stories that would really suspend my capacity to sit down. I would try, but I wouldn't be able to sustain it. So one advantage, however, to having delayed this process for all this time is that my head is full of stories that go back decades. They're just all in my head, and they're just dying to come out. And so this, in a sense, is the positive way to see, you know, why it took me so long to actually just become a full-time writer, is that you know, I'm writing. So there is the Gospel of Damascus, but then there's the trilogy of these novellas. Then there's 3 novels that have something in common. They're all finished. And then there's another one that belongs to another set. So I'm actually writing the 5th now, which Noel hasn't seen yet, and almost halfway through. But I'm already thinking about the one that's coming here. So they're just
Unbelievable.
You know, right. And it has to stop. I mean, this momentum.
No. It does not. You can keep going because
Right.
they just get better and better.
Realistically, it doesn't seem, you know, I speak again to some author friends, you know, and I think I mentioned this to you before we started. One of them was saying to me, Omar, this is what we call indecent taste. He said, where does this come from? It has to stop. And she says this with an element of both admiration and jealousy.
And jealousy, yeah.
Right, because she's like, you know, I write a novel a year, and you're writing 4. How does this work? But I think it's bound to slow down. But the stories, they're just keep coming, and yeah.
You're on this artistic just adventure with yourself, and it's like, I mean, it's unbelievable because every story is very different, by the way. It's crazy, these ideas and characters that come to him, and then how quickly he can not just put them down on paper, but like almost perfectly put them down on paper, right? I mean, I say that I'm his creative editor, and he barely listens to what, like, if I tell him to do something, and that's what he was trying to say too, is what we do is we discuss a lot of things to help get what he already has out there in a different way. But it's not like a traditional editing job at all. And the copy editor has almost no work to do with him. So he goes from everything in his head, and it's all completely different stories, to having them just on paper in such a short amount of time. It's incredible. It's really incredible. I mean, I remember the first time we met, and we were, you know, okay, I'll be your creative content editor. So where are you at in this process? Like, do you have a lot of it written? Do you just have an outline? And he goes, oh, no, it's all in my head, but I'll have the first draft to you in 2 weeks or something. I think 10 days later, I had the first draft in my hands, and I was like, holy shit, you know, this is.
Omar, have you always had a facility with words? Always, your whole life?
You know, my mother's my grandmother on my mother's side, my maternal grandmother, she was in love with words. She died in 95, I believe. And this old woman, she's called the matriarch of Palisades, Mildred Post. Yes, Mildred Lawrence Post. And she would just sit down, and she had this scrapbook, and it was full of, there's no computers obviously or anything like that. It's just full of these words and clips and stuff. She'd sit me down, and she would take me, she'd open each one, and she'd read these old poems or things she's found in various places, and she glues them into this space. And I just, I would find that just so breathtaking, and no one really wanted to sit with her. But she understood that I was truly taking this in, and I would just see her eyes, the way they would just glow as she was, and she would sometimes just stop at one word and just repeat it, almost like a religious mantra of some sort. And just, that had a very, very significant impact on me. But also Arabic, though I don't use Arabic in my novels, Arabic is a very rich language, a beautiful language, and so colorful, and so many words that try to, identify the same experience in various ways and intensities and stages. So there is that also in the background, I think.
I think so too.
Yes.
Yeah. You're able to express yourself in a very unique way in English because the Arabic language is in the background that has a lot more robust language. You can really get
playing a role. Yeah, it's not always conscious, but I begin with the assumption that there must be several words for this thing I'm trying to describe, and perhaps at different stages of evolution and at different angles. And yes.
And you've been a poet for a really long time. I mean, you got into poetry and
poetry could take place during these other jobs because it's it's an intense burst of, so that would happen, and it was mostly private. I mean, I would do it for myself, but that if there was something creative throughout those previous lives and careers, it would be the moments I would sit and write a poem. Yes.
Wow. What else?
So right, so he's got a couple more books coming.
Yeah, well, clearly.
Right. Yeah, and they're very different. The next one is Celeste, which I gave you a briefing for, and then there's a couple more, probably 2 published this year, and then a couple
2 more this year. 2 more books this year.
But he already has 4 of them written, and one of them half written, and the other one in his brain. So.
And the next one's going to be like a Western, right? A modern Western.
Right. Quentin Tarantino style, right?
What I'm actually currently writing is it's about this a photographer who wants to write, or not write actually, but photograph various photos that capture the experience of waiting. So people who wait at train stations, people who wait in hospitals, people maybe who wait at coffee shops. And as he begins to pursue this project, he comes across these different women and men who are who experience waiting in a very existential way, waiting for different things. And so the project becomes, it moves from random strangers, sitting at a bus stop waiting for the bus, to specific people whose entire life evolves around waiting for something, different things. Yes.
Well, now
Omar's
I'm eager.
Yeah, he's really changing things up so much with the content, and that's why I think it's such an interesting thing to follow his natural progression, because the content is very reflective of that, and it's a fun journey to go on personally with him because he's my friend and colleague, and just also as a reader. Yeah.
Well, I'm now looking forward to it. So
thank you.
So
we didn't tell you before, but now we have.
Yeah. Well, so here's the truth. Despite being in school for many years, I'm dyslexic.
Don't read.
And so, and I love to read, which is really oxymoronic. It is a chore,
Yes.
and yet I yearn for it, right?
Well,
So
I've got an answer for you. Our books are available on Audible.
yeah, I can't do it. I've got to be. I've got to see it. I've got to see it. So it's really something, and so I am looking forward to it.
Well,
I'm
thank
looking forward to it. Well, so what else do you want to say before we?
Well, I think I wasn't sure to the extent to which you knew the way in which I experienced our conversations. That was really what I was referring to. I think the conversations that we would have regarding some of these stories and the way in which I felt you had almost sometimes a stronger grip on these ideas than I felt I had, and trying then to modify the content in a manner that actually fit into this perspective. I think I wasn't sure. I never actually said this to you in this clarity. So that's what I was referring to. You get so seriously, you know. She would sit and she would. No, I mean it's and what she was trying to identify is what's the underlying, I think, content. Yes, and
Well, I hope I get the privilege of meeting both of you again in the flesh.
yes, that would be lovely.
But the idea of creating a path or painting a path with words is it's sort of miraculous to me. So
Because
That's
yours
great.
would be backwards.
so anyway, I that I want you to keep doing it.
Well, thank you. Yes, I don't think I really have a choice right now.
Yeah,
It's
clearly.
yes.
Yeah, David, thank you for inviting us to.
Yeah, well,
speak.
I hope I've done justice and allowed you to do justice, and we shall see. So